She stood beside the man
What
she
has
built a
happened
kingdom
here?
with, and watched him
We
give
must
that
protect
kingdom
what is
to
ours.
someone else. 10 years. 10 years of cold winters, border wars, and councils that never wanted her at that table. She held the line every single time. And tonight, in front of every alpha and elder who ever doubted her, Darius Vale looked her in the eye and called her not enough. But here's what they forgot. What he forgot. You don't survive a decade in a Wolf King's court by being fragile. Drop your city in the comments. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about power, loyalty, and what a Luna is truly capable of. The carriages had been rolling into Moonfire Keep since noon. Evelyn watched them from the upper corridor of the East Wing, the wing where Darius never came anymore, the one that smelled like old stone, and the dried lavender she'd hung herself 3 years back when no one else thought to make the space livable. She watched the procession of black-bannered coaches and painted war horses fill the courtyard below, alpha delegations from every corner of the realm pressing into the same cobblestone square she'd stood in the night Darius first brought her here as his chosen mate. She'd been 22. She hadn't known yet what chosen meant in a kingdom like this one. She knew now. Her handmaid, Petra, was cinching the back of her ceremonial gown, deep slate blue, the color Darius had picked for her at their bonding, the color she'd worn to every formal gathering since. Evelyn's fingers rested against the cold stone of the windowsill. Her jaw was set. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours, and she could feel it in the fine tension behind her eyes, the way everything in her peripheral vision moved a half-second slower than it should. "You're too tight on the left side," Evelyn said. "My apologies, Luna." Petra's hands adjusted. The older woman's fingers were precise and quiet. She'd been Evelyn's attendant for 6 years and had learned not to fill silence with comfort she couldn't back up. Below, one of the arriving alphas, Crag, from the Northern Mountain Territories, a man built like a siege wall, was laughing at something near the main gate. The sound carried up easily. Everything about tonight was going to carry. That was the point of Moonfire gatherings. 500 attendees minimum. Every influential voice in the realm under one roof. Witnesses, Evelyn had always thought. The kingdom doesn't trust decisions it can't witness. She turned from the window. The gown was the right choice. She'd spent 40 minutes deciding, which was 40 minutes more than she'd spent on gowns in the last 2 years. But tonight was their 10th year, and Darius had sent word 3 days ago that the gathering would include a formal announcement, something significant for the kingdom's future. She had assumed, in that quiet and careful way she'd learned to assume things, that he meant the border consolidation treaty, or the succession council appointments she'd been working toward for 8 months. She had not let herself assume anything warmer than that. "Luna!" Petra stepped back. "You look fine." Evelyn cut it off before the woman could land somewhere awkward. "I look fine. That's what I need." She crossed to the mirror. The woman looking back at her was 32 years old, lean in the way that 10 years of stress and irregular meals made a person lean, with dark hair pulled back into a formal knot and eyes the color of deep river water, gray-green and still. There were shadows under those eyes that the candlelight was kind enough to soften. There were lines at the corners of her mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been running a kingdom's softer machinery, the alliances, the pack welfare councils, the border family resettlement programs, while its king ran its harder edges. A woman who had made herself indispensable in every way that didn't show. She straightened her spine. Whatever Darius had planned to announce tonight, she would stand beside him and hold her face still and let the kingdom see exactly what 10 years had made of her. Not a trophy, not a figurehead, a Luna who had survived this long by being harder to break than anyone had counted on. She walked to the door. The great hall of Moonfire Keep had been built to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings of black timber and gray stone, fire channels running the length of both side walls so that the whole room flickered with amber and shadow, and a central dais raised 3 feet above the floor where the Alpha King stood when he needed the room to feel the difference between itself and him. Evelyn had always found the architecture honest, at least. Darius had never pretended the throne was a place of warmth. She entered through the east arch, taking her position at the edge of the dais before the hall filled beyond standing room. Several of the arriving alphas caught her eye and nodded. Old Gareth from the eastern lowlands, who'd always respected her, and the Bryn sisters from the coastal territories, who'd worked with her directly on the fishing rights mediation 2 years back. Evelyn returned each nod with the precise, measured acknowledgement she'd spent years calibrating. Not cold, not warm, present. Darius was already on the dais. He stood at the center in full ceremonial black. The moonfire sigil worked in silver across his chest. He was 41 and looked it in the way that power and physical dominance aged a man well. Broad through the shoulders, jaw hard, dark eyes that moved across the room with the automatic calculation of someone who had been reading threat levels since childhood. He was, by any accounting, an impressive figure. He did not look at her when she took her position beside him. That was not unusual. Darius had stopped reaching for her in public 2 years ago, and in private, she killed that thought before it could finish itself. Tonight wasn't for private accounting. The hall filled over the next 40 minutes. The low roar of pack politics and territorial posturing bounced off the stone ceiling. Evelyn kept her posture open and her expression composed and spoke briefly with 3 separate delegation heads who approached the dais during the informal period. She answered questions about the lowland water allocation dispute. She confirmed the date of the next Luna's council session. She did the work she always did at these things. The connective tissue work, the part that made the kingdom function between the moments its king was watching. Darius had still not spoken to her when the herald called the hall to attention. The room settled. 500 people going quiet at once had a particular quality, a held-breath density, like weather about to break. Evelyn stood straight. She folded her hands in front of her. She waited. Darius stepped to the front edge of the dais. 10 years ago, he said, and his voice carried without effort. That was another thing about him. The voice, the way it moved through a room like it owned the acoustics. I stood in this hall and made a promise to this kingdom, that I would lead with strength, that I would choose what the realm required, not what I preferred. Evelyn's eyes moved to the crowd. She could feel the attention shifting. Something about the room's temperature was wrong. She'd lived long enough in political spaces to feel it, the particular stillness of a crowd that already knows something the person beside you doesn't. I have upheld that promise, Darius continued, and tonight I uphold it again. He turned, not to Evelyn, to the east arch. The doors opened. She came through them like someone had arranged her arrival as theater, and Evelyn understood immediately, in the animal direct way the body understands things before the mind catches up, that this had been arranged. All of it. The doors opened at exactly the right moment. The crowd had that stillness because they had been told. The woman walking toward the dais was young, early 20s maybe, with silver blonde hair loose across her shoulders and a gown the color of new moonlight, and she moved through the parting crowd with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this walk. Evelyn did not move. She kept her hands folded. She kept her face still. The young woman, Celine, Evelyn would learn her name in the next 60 seconds and spend the rest of the night forcing herself not to think too hard about how long she'd been learning it, ascended the dais steps and stopped beside Darius. He reached for her hand. He took it. He had not touched Evelyn in 14 months. This is Celine of the Whitecrest bloodline, Darius said, my true mate, confirmed by the bond and by the Council of Elders 3 days past. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a crowd watching something they were not certain they were allowed to react to yet. Evelyn breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. The fire channels were very bright. She was aware of every person in the room turning, slightly, to look at her. Darius turned to her as well. His face was what it always was. Composed, strategic, carrying nothing she could read as guilt or apology, or even the basic human discomfort of a man doing something he knew was cruel. Evelyn Hart, he said. Not Luna, she noted that immediately, just her name, stripped of the title she'd carried for 10 years. Has served this kingdom faithfully. But a kingdom requires an air of strength. The Luna bloodline she carries has proven insufficient to that need. There it was. Not a quiet dissolution, not a private conversation. A public accounting of her failure, itemized in front of every alpha and elder who would carry it home to every corner of the realm. Insufficient. Something moved in her chest, deep, tectonic. The the kind of pain that doesn't have a sharp edge because it's too large to be sharp. She felt it move through her, and she did not let it reach her face. Furthermore, Darius continued, as is customary with a sacred mating recognition, the outgoing Luna will offer the ceremonial blessing. The hall stirred. Old Gareth's face shifted. She caught it from the corner of her eye. The lowered brow, the look of a man calculating what he was witnessing. The Bryn sisters were still. Most of the room was still, held in that suspended uncertainty of a crowd that suspects it has just watched something indecent and has not yet decided whether to say so. Evelyn understood exactly what was happening. She was being asked to stand in front of 500 witnesses and sanctify the thing that was destroying her. The symbolism was deliberate. There was not a person in that hall who would miss it. She had approximately 4 seconds to decide what she was. She stepped forward. "I'll offer the blessing," she said. Her voice came out level. That was what 10 years had bought her, if nothing else. A voice that could be level when everything underneath it was tearing loose. A ripple went through the crowd. She didn't know if it was respect or discomfort or something uglier. She didn't look to find out. She kept her eyes on the ceremonial fire basin at the center of the dais, the wide bronze bowl where the moonfire flame burned year-round, tended and maintained, the oldest symbol in the kingdom's public ritual language. She walked to it. Behind her, she could hear Darius murmuring something to Celine. She did not turn around. Old Gareth's voice came from the crowd, low, directed at the man beside him, but carrying in the stone acoustics. "This is not how it's done." Someone else shushed him. Evelyn reached the fire basin. The flame was low and steady, blue gold at the core, and the heat came off it in clean, radiating waves. She had stood before this flame many times. She knew the blessing by reflex, a 3-part invocation, hands extended, palms down, the traditional words that called the pack's recognition to bear on whatever was being consecrated. She pressed her palms toward the heat and opened her mouth. Before the blessing, Darius's voice stopped her. "There is one further matter." She turned. He was holding a folded document. The Elder Council's seal was visible from where she stood. "By order of the Council and this throne," he said, "the title of Luna is hereby transferred, effective tonight. Evelyn Hart is released from all pack bonds, titles, and territorial claims associated with the Moonfire Crown." Released from pack bonds. She understood what that meant. It didn't mean divorced in the human language sense. It meant severed. Severed from the pack connection, the living thread that ran between a bonded Luna and the collective. The thing she'd felt every day for 10 years, the background hum of thousands of lives she was responsible for. They were going to cut that, tonight, in front of everyone, and they wanted her to bless it first. Bam! She did not cry. That was the thing that would travel after. The story that spread from pack to pack over the following weeks, the one that got embellished and revised until it was half legend. The Luna who did not cry. The Luna who stood in front of every alpha in the realm while her mate announced she was being discarded for younger blood, while her title was stripped and her pack bond severed in real time, and she kept her face as still as river ice and her spine as straight as a sword. What the story didn't carry was the detail. The way her left thumbnail was pressing into the heel of her palm hard enough to leave a mark that would still be there 2 days later. The way her breathing had gone very shallow and precise, like she was managing each inhale individually, the way you manage steps across unstable ground. The way the ceremonial fire looked, from 2 feet away, with her eyes stinging from heat and the effort of keeping them open and dry. She completed the blessing. Every word in the right order, the right cadence, the tone and rhythm that made it real in the kingdom's traditional accounting. Her voice did not shake. She said the words that consecrated Celine as the new bonded Luna of the Moonfire throne, and she said them with the kind of precision that let no one in the room mistake her for a woman who was broken. There was a long silence when she finished. Then Darius spoke the traditional response, and the hall's tension broke into the complicated, uncomfortable applause of a crowd that didn't know which way to look. Evelyn stepped back from the fire. She folded her hands again. She stood in the position she'd occupied for 10 years, just off-center, to the left of the throne's sightline, and she did not move from it for the next 2 hours while the gathering proceeded around her. No one approached her directly. A few people tried. Old Gareth made his way toward her during the post-ceremony gathering, and she saw him coming and met him with a look that stopped him 6 feet short. He read it correctly. He nodded once, with the small, compressed grief of an old man who had seen enough political violence to know when comfort was a form of condescension, and he moved away. The whispers were constant. She was too practiced at these events to not hear them. The low-current language of 500 people processing what they'd witnessed. She caught fragments. Always knew the bloodline wasn't strong enough. 3 days ago, the council never actually bonded, is what I heard. The fire never fully. Feel sorry for her, honestly, but what can she? She filed each one, not to react to understand, to build a map of what the kingdom was being told and what it was choosing to believe, because that information was going to matter. She didn't know for what yet, but she had spent 10 years learning that information always mattered eventually. Celine stood beside Darius and smiled the careful smile of a woman who was new to the performance of power and trying very hard not to show the effort. She was young. Evelyn had been right about that. Closer to 20 than 25. The silver blonde hair was real, and so was the Whitecrest bloodline, which was old and respectable in the kingdom's genealogical accounting. The girl had been chosen carefully. Evelyn watched Celine and tried to feel what she was supposed to feel. Some uncomplicated outrage at the specific woman who had replaced her. She couldn't quite get there. The girl was a piece in something, not the thing itself. She wasn't sure yet what the thing itself was. They gave her 2 rooms in the guest wing that night, not the east wing where she'd lived for a decade. The guest wing, with its impersonal stone walls and borrowed furniture, and the particular smell of spaces that had never been anyone's home. A guard outside the door. Not hostile, but there. Petra was allowed in. She came with Evelyn's few personal items, which had been packed for her, which meant someone had been in her rooms before the ceremony had even ended. Efficiency that required advanced preparation. Evelyn noted it and kept the note flat and clinical in her mind, because the moment she let it be something other than data, it was going to become grief. "Where will they send you?" Petra asked. She was folding Evelyn's things into a travel case with the controlled movements of a woman who was furious and managing it the same way Evelyn was managing everything else. "I don't know yet." Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. She'd finally let her spine bend now that she was alone enough for it. "Away from the capital, I'd assume. They'll want the visible reminder out of reach." "Is there family you could bow us?" "No." Her parents had been gone for 6 years. Her younger brother was 3 territories east and had his own pack entanglements. She wasn't pulling him into this. Petra was quiet for a moment, then, "There are people in the capital who respect you." "There are people in the capital who respected my title." Evelyn looked at her hands in her lap. The mark from her thumbnail was still there on her palm. A small half-moon indentation, fading now. "Those aren't the same thing. I always knew that." "I don't believe that's true." "I know you don't." She looked up at Petra and let herself be briefly, privately honest with the older woman's face. "Thank you for that." She slept badly. The guest room's mattress was wrong, and the sounds of the keep were different from this wing. The night watch's footsteps on a different pattern, the wind hitting a different angle of stone. She was aware of the absence of the pack bond like an amputee is aware of a missing limb. Not a pain exactly, but a constant reference to a sensation that wasn't there anymore. The low background warmth of thousands of connected lives, the pack's collective presence that she'd felt every moment of the last 10 years, was gone. Cut clean. She lay in the dark and breathed. Around the 3rd hour of the night, when the keep had gone fully quiet and the fire in the small guest room hearth had burned down to embers, she stopped trying to sleep and let herself think. Not about Darius. Not yet. That was a wound she couldn't probe and stay functional. About the council. 3 days ago, the seal had said. The decision had been made 3 days before the ceremony. That meant the Council of Elders had been convened, deliberated, and issued a formal ruling on her removal before she had any indication anything was coming. That was either a remarkable failure of her intelligence, and she maintained intelligence carefully, quietly, through the network of contacts she'd spent 10 years building, or someone had gone to significant effort to keep her blind. She ran the council members in her mind. 7 elders, appointed for life, the kingdom's institutional memory and its primary check on the throne's power. She knew all 7. She'd worked with 4 of them directly. The remaining 3 had always sat at the edge of her influence. The older generation, the ones who'd served under Darius's father and carried that era's politics forward. Elder Voss, Elder Crane, Elder Aldrich. 3 men who had never been warm to her. 3 men who had consistently, quietly, pushed back on her welfare council initiatives and border protection reforms. 3 men who had everything to gain from a Luna whose political instincts were focused inward on pack protection, being replaced with one who was young and untested and would need to defer to existing power structures for at least several years while she found her footing. Evelyn stared at the embers and let the shape of it form. This wasn't about Darius finding a mate he loved more. She had believed that, briefly, in the first hour. The simple, terrible story of a man who wanted something younger and found a justification. But the mechanism was wrong. The council seal 3 days prior. The coordinated silence that had kept her from any warning. The very particular language Darius had used, insufficient bloodline, insufficient heir, which happened to be the exact language required to trigger Article 7 of the kingdom's foundational pack law, the article that allowed a Luna's removal on grounds of dynastic necessity. Someone had briefed him on that language. Darius was politically capable, but he didn't reach for legal architecture without guidance. He solved problems with presence and force, not statute. Someone had built this. She sat up. She found the first thread the following morning. She should have been confined to the guest rooms or en route to some distant estate by then. That was the logical move, get the removed Luna out of the capital before she could start pulling at things. But the formal exile order hadn't been delivered yet. Bureaucratic lag, or someone had forgotten her in the overnight chaos of the ceremony's aftermath, or they'd assumed she'd have the dignity to stay in her rooms. She used the morning. She moved through the keep's back corridors, servants' routes, maintenance passages, the routes she'd learned in the first year when she'd understood that the keep's real information didn't travel through the main halls. She wasn't trying to confront anyone. She was listening. In the lower corridor behind the Elder Council's meeting hall, she found Marin. Marin was 19, a junior record keeper for the council secretariat, and she was one of the people in the keep who had always liked Evelyn without the complications of politics. She had started crying approximately 30 seconds into the ceremony the night before and had apparently not entirely stopped. "Luna?" she started, and then stopped, looking uncertain about the title. "Evelyn?" Evelyn said. "It's just Evelyn now. You can use it." She kept her voice easy. "Walk with me." They walked the lower corridor. Evelyn let the silence run for a moment, which was always the better approach than pressing directly. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," Marin said finally. "I know." Elder Voss was very specific about it. I'd expect that from Elder Voss. She kept her tone neutral. He's been specific about a lot of things lately. Marin's breath hitched slightly. Evelyn marked it. "The council met privately," Marin said, low and fast, like she was making a decision she couldn't take back. 4 times in the last 6 weeks. I filed the meeting records. Elder Voss hosted the last 3. He and Elder Crane and Elder Aldrich, and Celine was at the last 2. Evelyn kept walking. She kept her pace even. "Celine was at council meetings 6 weeks ago." "Yes." Marin pressed her lips together. "She wasn't listed as an attendee. I noticed because I had to prepare the rooms and she came in through the private entrance that Elder Voss uses. I wasn't supposed to see." "But you did." "I file everything." Marin said it with the small, serious dignity of someone who took her work seriously and had no idea yet how much that was going to matter. "There are things in the files that shouldn't be there. Financial records I couldn't reconcile. Correspondence between Voss and someone in the Whitecrest territory that predates any formal introduction of Celine to the throne." Evelyn stopped walking. She turned to face Marin, and she looked at the young woman steadily and carefully, because what she said next mattered. "If I asked you to preserve those files," she said, "would you be putting yourself in danger?" Marin's eyes were red from the previous night. She held Evelyn's gaze. "I already pulled copies," she said. "Last night, Before the ceremony was over, I hid them. A long pause. I didn't know if you'd ask, but I thought you might. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. People didn't do that for titles. They did it because of something they'd seen in a person over time. 10 years of being the Luna who actually showed up to the welfare councils and remembered everyone's names and fought, quietly and unglamorously, for the stuff that didn't make it into songs or ceremonies. Where? She asked. I can get them to you before sundown. Then do that. She started walking again. And Marin, be careful. Don't do anything that makes you visible. Yes, Lou. Yes. The young woman caught herself. Evelyn? The exile order arrived that afternoon. It was delivered by a palace functionary she didn't know, which told her that Darius had been careful not to send anyone who had a relationship with her. The document was formal and thorough. The same Article 7 language she'd expected, a 30-day allowance to vacate her personal quarters at any Moonfire properties, and a territorial restriction that would confine her to the western lowlands. The western lowlands were remote, resource-poor, effectively out of the kingdom's main conversation. She signed the receipt and handed it back and said nothing. The files arrived at dusk, tucked inside a provision delivery. Marin's handwriting on the inner packet, careful and small. Evelyn sat at the window of her guest room in the failing light and read. 3 things. First, correspondence between Elder Voss and a factor in the Whitecrest territory beginning 14 months ago, 2 months before Darius had begun pulling away from her. The letters discussed the Whitecrest bloodline's qualities in the language of an arranged outcome, not a discovered one. Celine had not been found by fate. She'd been positioned. Second, financial transfers from a discretionary council account to 3 separate intermediaries over the past year. The amounts were significant. The destinations were coded, but the coding was consistent with the pattern she'd seen in political influence payments she'd helped Darius investigate, back when he'd still trusted her judgment enough to let her into those conversations. Third, a single medical document, unstamped and unattributed, which claimed to document a bloodline assessment of Evelyn Hart, Luna of the Moonfire Throne. The assessment concluded that her bloodline carried a recessive anomaly that would prevent the production of a dominant heir. The document was a forgery. She knew it was a forgery because she had undergone a genuine bloodline assessment 7 years ago, conducted by the kingdom's foremost pack physician, and the results had been clean. She'd been shown those results. She'd kept her own copy. She'd never told Darius she kept it, because she'd never expected to need it, and had not wanted to seem like she was anticipating a need for self-defense in her own marriage. She'd been wrong to make that assumption, but the copy existed. She sat with the papers in her lap and the window behind her going dark, and the keep settling into its evening sounds. She breathed carefully through the anger, which was large and clean, and had the quality of something that could be useful if she didn't let it run ahead of her thinking. They had removed her because she was the obstacle. Not because she'd failed the kingdom, not because Darius had fallen genuinely in love with someone new, because she was the person in this political structure with both the information access and the independent credibility to catch what Voss and Crane and Aldrich were building, and they'd spent 14 months engineering a way to cut her out before she could see it clearly enough to stop it. The civil war the pack whispers had mentioned in the weeks before the gathering, the border tensions, the resource disputes, the unusual movement of forces in 3 separate territories. It wasn't organic instability. Someone was manufacturing the conditions for something. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the paper. The false medical document, the advanced coordination with Celine, the 3 elders, the financial transfers, the deliberate silencing of her intelligence network. Someone was manufacturing a war, and they had just removed the only person in the kingdom positioned to see all of it. She stood. She crossed to the travel case Petra had packed and moved aside the folded garments until her fingers found the false bottom she'd had built in 3 years ago, after the second assassination attempt on the border that Darius had publicly attributed to bandit activity and she had privately attributed to a different source entirely. The false bottom held 3 things: a personal seal she'd never registered with the palace, a letter of introduction written in her own hand to a contact in the Eastern Territories, and a small, flat packet containing the 7-year-old bloodline assessment results. She added Myron's files to the packet. She had 30 days before the exile order required her to vacate. She had a forgery that proved the council had lied to the king. She had financial evidence of coordination between the elders and a foreign territory. And she had the distinct clarifying sensation of a woman who had spent 10 years being useful to a structure that had just tried to bury her, finally understanding exactly how useful she could be when she was no longer playing by that structure's rules. She was still standing at the travel case when Petra knocked. "Luna." The old habit. "There's someone at the servants' entrance asking for you." A pause that carried weight. "He says his name is Brother Kale, and he says you'll know why he's come." Evelyn went still. Kale. The name didn't mean anything to most of the kingdom. To her, it meant exactly one thing. A contact she'd last used 3 years ago, a man who operated in the gray space between packs and reported to no one, who she'd paid in information rather than coin, and who had surfaced exactly once since then to warn her about the second border incident before it became public knowledge. She had not contacted him. She had not contacted anyone outside these walls since the ceremony, which meant Kale had come on his own, which meant Kale knew something she didn't yet, which meant the situation was larger than even she had calculated. She picked up the sealed packet. She crossed to the door. "Bring him up," she said. "And Petra, I'll see that we're not observed." The older woman said it flatly, without drama, in the voice of someone who had already taken her side. Evelyn waited. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, low red. The keep was quiet. Outside her window, Moonfire Keep spread below her. The courtyard, the banners, the lights of a kingdom that had just decided it didn't need her. And somewhere in the dark beyond the walls, in the movement of forces and finances and carefully arranged betrayals, something was already in motion that she had only just begun to see the shape of. The footsteps on the stairs were careful and even. When the door opened, Kale stepped into the room, and one look at his face told her that whatever she'd spent the last 6 hours calculating was still the smaller half of the truth. "How bad?" she asked. He closed the door behind him. "They're not just moving against the throne," he said. "They've already made contact with 4 rival Alpha lines." He set a sealed packet on the table between them, thicker than hers, and she could see the edges of multiple documents inside. "There's a summit scheduled for 9 days from now in the Northern Territories. Every elder who voted for your removal will be there. And Celine?" He stopped. "Say it." "Celine's bloodline document isn't the only forgery in the Council's files." His voice was quiet and hard. "They also forged the bond verification, the sacred mate confirmation. Darius's bond with you was never broken. It was suppressed. There's a method, it's old, and it's not clean, but they found someone who knew how to do it." He met her eyes. "He thinks he's free of you. He's not. And they're counting on him not knowing that until it's too late to matter." The room was very still. Evelyn set her hand flat on the table. The bond had never broken, which meant everything Darius had said in front of 500 witnesses, the false mate, the forged bloodline assessment, the very specific legal language of the Article 7 removal, was built on a foundation that, if exposed, would not merely embarrass the throne. It would tear the kingdom in half. And somewhere in the Northern Territories, 9 days from now, 3 elders and 4 rival Alpha lines were planning to be present when it did. "How long have you known about the suppression?" she asked. "Long enough that I came here before going anywhere else." She looked at him. "Then we need to move faster than 9 days." Kale's packet hit the table between them, and Evelyn didn't reach for it immediately. That was discipline, not hesitation. She'd learned years ago that the first grab at new information was almost always the wrong grab, the one driven by the gut instead of the mind, the one that told you what you wanted the information to mean rather than what it actually said. She breathed once, flat and even, and looked at Kale's face instead. He was 40-something, lean in the way of men who traveled hard and ate whatever the road offered, with a scar along his left jaw that she'd never asked about and he'd never explained. His eyes were the particular color of exhausted brown that came from years of watching things from the outside. He was not a man who frightened easily, and he was frightened now, not in any way that showed on his face, but in the careful stillness of his hands, which he'd placed flat on his thighs the moment he sat down. "The bond suppression," she said. "Walk me through the method." "Old blood work, pre-kingdom era, before the council codified the mate bond laws." He kept his voice low and flat. "There's a practitioner in the Ashvin territory, Doesn't advertise, doesn't take walk-ins. Works for coin and stays quiet because the work he does doesn't survive scrutiny. He paused. He's done 3 suppressions in the last decade. Yours is the 4th I know of. Who commissioned the other 3? 2 of them. Elder Voss. Evelyn picked up the packet. She broke the seal and worked through the documents in order, the same way she worked through everything. Surface first, looking for the shape before the detail. Financial records. A hand-copied correspondence thread in writing she didn't recognize. A map of the Northern Territories with 4 locations marked in red, and beside each mark a name. She recognized 2 of the alpha names. One was Brecken of the Iron March, a territorial lord who had spent 6 years filing formal complaints against the Moonfire Throne's border policies, every one of which she had personally mediated. He'd always been difficult, but not dangerous, the kind of man who pushed hard in rooms where pushing was allowed. The second was Aldrich's nephew, which told her the elder's family investment in this outcome went deeper than she'd calculated. The summit, she said without looking up. What's the stated purpose? Trade arbitration. Cale's voice was dry enough to burn. Voss drafted the invitations himself. Very formal, very bureaucratic, the kind of language that reads clean in a historical record. But the actual agenda? Replacement of the throne's succession structure. They're moving to install a governance council, 7 seats, elder appointed, with the Alpha King retained as a figurehead. Military command transfers to a rotating council authority. He watched her. Celine's position as Luna is the linchpin. If the mate bond is publicly certified and the heir is produced within a designated window, the council's authority becomes permanent under an amendment they've already drafted. Evelyn set the map down. She looked at the fire. The governance council structure wasn't new. She'd seen versions of it proposed in the past, always defeated because it required the Alpha King's signature to ratify, and Darius had never been a man who would willingly reduce his own power. Which meant the question was how they intended to get his signature, and the answer, when she followed the thread, was Celine. A young mate, a new bond, a king who believed the old bond had been cleanly broken and was feeling, for the first time in however long, something uncomplicated. They would use that window, the period when Darius was emotionally off balance, when he was grateful to the people who had, as far as he understood it, freed him from a failing marriage, to get him to sign. By the time he understood what he'd ratified, the council authority would be legally permanent. He doesn't know, she said. No. And Celine. Cale was quiet for a moment. She knows more than she lets on. Whether she understands the full scope, he shook his head slightly. She's young. She may believe she's genuinely bonded to him. The suppression of your bond would feel, from her side, like a clean connection. She wouldn't be able to feel the interference. Evelyn absorbed that. She didn't want to feel anything complicated about Celine right now, and she mostly managed it. The girl was a piece in this, not the architect. That was relevant information, not an invitation to sympathy. I need to get to the Ashvin practitioner, she said. That's what I thought you'd say. It's 2 days hard travel east. Your exile restriction puts it outside your permitted territory. I'm aware. Evelyn. He said her name in the flat tone of a man making sure she was registering what he was about to say. If they catch you in violation of the exile order before you have proof in hand, Voss will use it to push for something more severe than Western Lowlands confinement. They need you quiet. Right now, you're a political embarrassment. If you become a legal problem, I know what I become. She looked at him directly. What's your read on the Ashvin practitioner? Is he buyable? He's already been paid once by Voss. That means his loyalty is transactional, not ideological, which means he's buyable by the higher bidder. She reached for the travel case. What do you need from me to make the trip possible? A reason to believe you can get out of the capital tonight without the guard on your door noticing until morning. I can manage that. She looked at Petra, who had been standing at the far edge of the room through all of it, with the expression of a woman who had been offered the chance to leave 3 times and had declined each time. Petra. I'll need until midnight, the older woman said. The East Wing Laundry sends a card out at the 3rd hour. I know the route. The cart smelled like lye soap and wet wool, and it was cold enough at the third hour that Evelyn's breath came out visible in the dark above the bundled linens. She lay flat and still under the top layer and counted the guard checkpoints by sound. 2 at the inner gate, 1 at the outer, the familiar sequence she'd mapped in her first year because she'd always known, on some level she never examined directly, that there might come a night when she needed it. Cale was waiting at the East Road junction with 2 horses. She climbed out of the cart and didn't speak until they were moving. "The practitioner's name," she said, "goes by Thresh. The Ashvin people use him for things they can't take to the pack physicians. He's not discreet out of loyalty. He's discreet because his clientele requires it." Cale kept his voice low against the sound of hooves on the packed earth road. "He'll talk if the coin is right, or if he's afraid enough." "I'd prefer coin first." "I'd prefer that too." A pause. "Are you going to tell me what you're going to do with the confirmation, assuming he gives it?" She thought about how to answer that, not because she was hiding it from Cale, he'd earned the plain version, but because she was still building the answer herself, in the moving, breathing way that real strategy built, rather than the clean, after-the-fact version that got written into histories. "The summit is 9 days away," she said. "Darius will be at the keep for at least 6 of those. If I can get the suppression documentation to him before he leaves for the north, he won't believe you." "I know. He just publicly called you insufficient in front of his entire kingdom. He signed the exile order. He's in the middle of what feels to him like a new bond with a new mate." Cale's voice was not unkind, just direct. "You walk back into that keep with a document from a gray territory practitioner claiming his bond with his new Luna is a forgery, and the first thing he does is hand you back to Voss. I know that too. So I don't go to him first." She looked at the road ahead. "I go to Gareth." Old Gareth, the Eastern Lowlands alpha who had made his disapproval visible last night, who had started moving toward her and stopped only when she'd signaled him away. A man who had enough standing in the kingdom to force a formal hearing if he invoked the Alpha Council's independent review process, a process that hadn't been used in 40 years, but was still written into the foundational law. "Gareth's not young," Cale said. "No. And the council will move to neutralize him the moment he starts making noise." "Yes." She let the road pass under them for a moment. "Which is why he can't be the only one. I need 2 more alphas who have reason to distrust what Voss is building. I need them before the summit, and I need the Ashvin documentation before I approach any of them, because without physical proof, I'm just a removed Luna with a motive and a grievance." Cale was quiet for a while. "You've been thinking about this since the ceremony," he said. "I've been thinking about this since the moment Darius said the word insufficient." She didn't make it dramatic, just true. "I knew then that it hadn't come from him. He doesn't reach for that kind of language on his own. Someone gave it to him. I just didn't know yet who or what it would cost them to sustain." Octal. They rode through the remainder of the night and into the gray early morning without stopping. The Ashvin territory's edge was marked by a change in the tree line, the dense northern hardwood giving way to the low, fog-bound scrub of the marshland districts, which smelled like standing water and cold earth. Evelyn had been here twice before, both times on pack welfare business, and she'd always found the landscape honest in an uncomfortable way. Nothing here was decorative. Thresh's location was a house that had been built with the explicit intention of not being found by anyone who hadn't been told where to look, set back from the main path behind a row of cultivated marsh brush, low-roofed and dark, the kind of structure that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Cale dismounted first. He looked at the house for a moment with the professional attention of a man checking sight lines. "He's there," he said. "Smoke from the back chimney. Come in with me, but let me lead the conversation." "Always do." Thresh answered the door before they knocked. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, small and compact, with hands that were disproportionately large and careful-looking, the hands of someone who worked with precision instruments. His eyes went to Evelyn's face and stayed there for 3 full seconds, in a way that made her understand he already knew who she was. "Luna Hart," he said. "Just Evelyn now, apparently." She held his gaze. "You know why I'm here." He stepped back from the door. "Come in, then." The interior smelled like something herbal and iron and was warmer than outside by enough to feel significant. He didn't offer them seats. He stood at the center of the main room with his large hands loose at his sides and looked at her with the expression of a man running a calculation he hadn't finished yet. "Voss paid you," she said. "A lot of people pay me. He paid you to suppress the Moonfire bond. I want documentation of the commission, the method, and the date." Thresh's expression didn't change much, but his hands moved, a slight shift, fingers flexing once. "That's a dangerous thing to ask for." "I know. Name your price." "It's not about price." His voice was measured. "If Voss finds out I gave you documentation, Voss is going to be facing an Alpha Council review inside of 2 weeks," she said. "If he survives that intact, you have a problem regardless of what you give me today. If he doesn't, you want to be on the right side of the record." She let that land. "I'm offering you that positioning, plus whatever coin number you name." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're sure about the council review?" "I'm sure." He moved to the back room. She heard the sound of a locked case opening. Cale leaned close and said very quietly, "You're not sure." "I'm sure enough," she said, equally quiet. "Give me the documentation and I'll be completely sure." Thresh returned with a leather folio. He set it on the table and opened it to the 3rd page. "Commission record," he said. "Elder Voss, his personal seal, 8 months ago. The nature of the work described in the trade language I use for the books. But it's clear enough when you know what you're reading." He turned to the next page. "The binding agent I used and its source. And this," he turned to the last document, which was a single page of dense notation, "is the record of the suppression itself. Date, method, and the subject identification." Her name was written at the top of the subject line. Below it, Darius's. She looked at her own name written in a stranger's record of something done to her without her knowledge, and felt something she was not going to name in this room pass through her chest and out the other side. "What do you want?" she said. He told her. She paid it. Most of what she had in the travel case's false bottom, which was enough because she'd always kept enough for the emergency she'd always half known was coming. She took the folio. Outside, mounting up, Kyle looked at her across the horses. "Gareth first," he said. "Gareth first." She tucked the folio inside her riding coat. Her hands were steady. "Then we need to find out if Brecken of the Iron March wants a reason to distrust his summit invitation. Brecken hates Voss." "Good." She turned the horse east. "Hate is an excellent starting point." They'd ridden perhaps a half mile when Cale pulled up short. She heard it a moment later. Hoofbeats, more than one rider, coming from the north on the same path they were using, moving fast. Not the casual speed of travelers, the speed of people who knew where they were going. She looked at Cale. "They knew about Thresh," she said. "Someone told them." His jaw was set. Or they were watching Thresh's location already. 4 riders came around the bend in the marsh path and pulled up 30 feet away. They were in plain riding gear. No palace colors, no pack markings. That was deliberate. Disavowable. The lead rider looked at Evelyn without the deference of someone who saw a Luna. "You're in violation of your exile restriction," he said. "Elder Voss requests your return to the capital." She looked at the 4 of them, at the road behind them, which was the only practical way back north, at the marsh on both sides of the path, which was navigable on foot but not on horseback, at Kyle, who had his hand on his knife without having made a decision about it yet. She thought about the folio inside her coat. She thought about 9 days, the summit, Gareth, Brecken, the forged bond verification, and the fake bloodline document, and the financial records that mapped a conspiracy 14 months in the making. She thought about Darius, who was at this moment in the Moonfire Keep believing he had a new mate and a clean start, being maneuvered toward a signature that would hollow out the throne he'd spent his life building. She thought briefly and without indulgence about the fact that she was alone in a marsh with 1 ally, 4 hostile riders, and the only physical evidence of everything they needed to prove. She straightened in the saddle. "Tell Elder Voss," she said, "that I'll be back in the capital very soon." She looked the lead rider in the eye and held it, and something in her face, the stillness of it, the absolute absence of fear, made him hesitate for just a fraction of a second too long. She turned her horse off the path into the marsh. "Cale, move." He moved. The riders shouted behind them. She heard the hooves on the path, heard them check at the marsh's edge. Horses didn't like the footing, and strange horses in strange territory liked it even less. She and Cale pushed through the low scrub at a pace that was brutally hard on the horses and her body both, the cold water spraying up with each step, the ground sucking at the hooves, and she kept her weight forward and her eyes on the firmer ground ahead and did not look back. They broke through to a secondary road a quarter-mile east. She pulled up and let the horse breathe for 10 seconds. 10 seconds was all she allowed. "They'll have more riders," Cale said. He was scanning the tree line, breathing hard. "Yes." She pressed the folio through her coat, checking it was intact. It was. "And now Voss knows I have something worth sending 4 riders to recover." She looked at Cale. "Which means we're not going to Gareth." "Where are we going?" She thought about what she'd said to Thresh. "You want to be on the right side of the record." She thought about what Cale had said at the start of all of this, in the guest room, with the keep quiet around them. They forged the bond verification. Darius's bond with you was never broken. She thought about Darius at the ceremony, his hand reaching for Celine's with the certainty of a man who believed in what he was doing, and the very specific quality of that certainty, which she'd spent 10 years reading closely enough to know when it was real and when it was the performance of a man who needed to believe something because the alternative was unbearable. She'd seen that performance before. She knew exactly what it looked like. "We're going to the keep," she said. Cale stared at her. "You just said you can't go to Darius without allies backing the claim." "I can't go to him as a removed Luna with a grievance." She turned the horse north. "But I can go to him as the person who just found out that 4 of Voss's riders were waiting outside a gray territory location that he had no legitimate reason to know about, which means the keep has a leak and Darius's new household is already compromised." She let Cale connect the rest of it. "He'll listen to a security breach," Cale said slowly. "He always listens to a security breach. And once you're in the room, once I'm in the room, I have the documentation and I have his attention." She held the horse to a hard trot. "And he'll have to decide in real time whether the man who has been managing his household security for the last 3 days or the woman who spent 10 years keeping this kingdom together is more likely to be lying." The road north was open and cold, and the morning light was coming in low and hard across the marsh flats. She was riding back into the keep she'd been expelled from, in violation of an exile order, with 4 hostile riders somewhere behind her and a conspiracy in her coat, to confront a man who had publicly destroyed her 2 days ago. She was also, for the first time since she'd stood at that fire basin, with her hands extended and her voice steady, and her thumbnail leaving a mark in her own palm, completely certain about what she was doing. Behind her, Cale's horse pulled up alongside. "They'll arrest you the moment you pass the gate," he said. "Then I need to be past the gate before they can organize the order." She looked at him. "How fast can you get me inside without using the main entrance?" He thought about it for 3 seconds. "There's a tradesman's access on the southwest corner. I know the morning rotation." "Then that's where we're going." They rode hard north, and the keep's dark towers came up against the sky ahead of them, and somewhere inside those walls, a man who believed himself free was being carefully, systematically maneuvered toward a decision that would end the kingdom as both of them had known it. She was going to walk back in there, not as a Luna asking for reinstatement, not as a wife asking for another chance. She was going to walk back in as the only person in the realm who held the proof that everything Darius Vale believed about the last 2 days was a lie. And she was going to put that proof in his hands and watch him decide in front of her who he actually was. The gate was visible now. The guard rotation was changing. She rode straight at it. The southwest gate was a maintenance access. Low arch, worn stone, the kind of entrance that existed because keeps needed supply lines and supply lines needed anonymity. Evelyn had used it twice before, both times in daylight, both times with legitimate reasons, both times with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the most useful routes in any structure were the ones its architects considered beneath notice. This time she came through it on foot, horse left with Cale at the outer tree line, her riding coat pulled close and the folio pressed against her ribs. The tradesman's rotation Cale had described put 2 guards on this entrance, Young ones, recently assigned, who would recognize her face and not yet have received specific instructions about what to do if they did. She walked through like she had somewhere to be. Neither of them stopped her. That was the thing about 10 years. It wrote itself into the way a person moved, the way they held their head, the particular quality of forward motion that said, I belong here and have always belonged here, and you are going to have to physically block my path to change that. She'd spent a decade becoming someone the Keep's stones recognized. That didn't end with a ceremony and a signed document. She moved through the maintenance corridor into the back of the East Wing and took the servants' stairs up 2 levels. She was thinking in the forward-only mode that came when the options behind you had been removed. Not calm exactly, but clear, the way a path looks when the brush has been cut away on both sides. And the only question is speed. Darius's private study was on the 3rd level of the central tower. She'd been in it hundreds of times. She knew which guard positions covered the approach and which of the morning rotations would have the shorter sightlines. She knew that between the 6th and 7th hour, the central corridor did a handoff that created a 4-minute gap. She moved into position and waited for the gap. It came. She went through the door. Bants. Darius was at the window with his back to her. He heard the door and turned, and the expression on his face moved through several things in very fast succession. Recognition, shock, something harder to name that might have been the beginning of guilt before it got locked down, and settled into the flat, controlled look she'd seen him use in council sessions when he was deciding how to handle a problem. She'd become a problem. She understood that. She walked to the center of the room anyway. You need to hear me, she said, not as your Luna, not as your wife. As the only person in this keep who has held physical documentation of a conspiracy against your throne for the last 12 hours. You're in violation of— I know what I'm in violation of. She pulled the folio from inside her coat and set it on the desk between them. Voss sent 4 riders to intercept me in the Ashfin territory. No palace markings, no authority documentation because the order wasn't official. He sent them to recover this. She opened the folio to the commission record. His seal. 8 months ago. The Ashfin practitioner he hired. Darius looked at the document. He didn't move toward it. That was telling. A man who believed she was simply a deposed Luna manufacturing evidence would have dismissed her at the door. He was still standing there, which meant some part of him was already doing arithmetic. Read the 3rd page, she said. He crossed to the desk. He read it. She watched his face and kept her own still. He was quiet for a long time. This could be fabricated, he said, finally. It could be, she agreed. The commission record, the method documentation, and the dated subject file could all be fabricated by a woman who was publicly removed from her title 48 hours ago, somehow obtained Elder Voss's personal seal, and convinced a gray territory practitioner to put his own name on forged documents that would expose him to criminal prosecution. She held his gaze. Or it's real, and your household security has been compromised since before the ceremony. Something moved through his jaw. She'd spent 10 years reading that jaw. Why did Voss want to stop you getting this? Because the bond suppression is the foundation of everything they've built. Without it, the mate bond certification is fraudulent. Without the certification, the Council's authority claim falls apart. Without the authority claim, the summit in 9 days has no legal basis. She paused. They need you believing the bond with me is broken. The moment you know it isn't, that's enough. His voice came out low and tight, the particular compression of a man keeping something in. The door opened. Elder Voss walked in. He was unhurried about it, which told Evelyn he'd been informed of her presence before he arrived. Enough time to compose himself, to come in without the tell of a man reacting to a surprise. He was 63 and built like a man who had once been physically substantial and had converted it into the subtler musculature of political force. He looked at Evelyn the way she'd seen men look at persistent structural problems, not with anger, but with the tired calculation of something that needed to be managed. Luna Hart. He didn't adjust the title. The deliberateness of that was its own message. I was told you'd made your way back to the keep. Your riders were slow, she said. Yes. He turned to Darius. My lord, she's in violation of her exile restriction. I've taken the liberty of alerting the guard. There will be a formal escort available in— Give us the room, Darius said. Voss paused. My lord, I would advise. I said give us the room. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man recalculating. Voss looked at the folio on the desk. His face remained composed, but his eyes moved to it with the quick, controlled attention of someone who had just identified the exact shape of a problem. Of course, he said. He left, but he didn't close the door all the way. Evelyn marked it. The gap was 3 inches, which in a stone corridor would carry sound 30 feet minimum. Voss had been in this keep longer than she had, and knew its acoustics as well as anyone. She lowered her voice. He knows what's in the folio, she said. I understood that. Darius had not moved from the desk. He was looking at the commission record again, and she could see the particular stillness in his shoulders of a man confronting something he'd already half known, but had been choosing not to know. How long? Cale's intelligence suggests the initial contact with the Whitecrest territory was 14 months ago. She kept her voice precise and quiet. 2 months before you started pulling away from me. He looked up. She held the look. She didn't make it an accusation. She'd already decided she wasn't going to, not yet, not in this room, because this wasn't about the marriage. The marriage was something else, something she was going to have to figure out what to do with eventually. But it wasn't the thing that mattered right now, and she needed him to know she understood that. I'm not here for us, she said. I'm here because in 9 days, 4 Alpha Lines and 3 Elders are meeting in the Northern Territories to ratify a governance structure that transfers military command out of your authority. They need your signature on the council amendment, and they're going to get it through Celine while you're still in the window of a new bond. A long beat. You have documentation of this. Financial records and correspondence, Cale's sources. She met his eyes. But the bond suppression is the hard evidence. The rest is inference with a paper trail. The suppression documentation is irrefutable. Darius looked at the folio for a long moment. Then he reached out and closed it. I need time to verify, he said. You have 9 days. To verify, Evelyn, not to act. Something about the way he said her name. The first time he'd used it without the stripped quality of the ceremony, with something that sounded like a person saying a word they'd temporarily forgotten, made her look at him differently for 1 second before she put that away. Then verify, she said. But keep Voss out of the investigation, because he will know what you're looking for, and he will move the summit date the moment he thinks you're getting close. He nodded once, the motion of a man who is already somewhere else in his head, running the lines, pulling at the threads. She picked up the folio. He looked at her hand on it. I need that to verify, he said. I'll give you copies. Marin can prepare them. She's already involved, and she's careful. She held the original against her chest. I keep the original. His jaw tightened. That's not... It's the only leverage I have. She said it plainly. You removed my title, my bonds, and my residence. You signed an order confining me to the Western Lowlands. I am standing in your study in violation of that order with 4 of Voss's riders having been deployed to intercept me this morning. If I give you the original documentation and you decide after Voss has 15 minutes alone with you that I fabricated all of it. She stopped. Let him finish the sentence himself. I keep the original. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to people telling him the terms of anything. Then he said, All right. Marin made the copies in the small records room off the east corridor, her hands quick and steady, her face carrying the focused blankness of someone who had decided to be useful and was executing that decision with everything she had. Evelyn stood at the door watching the corridor. She was aware, in the background of all of it, that she was exhausted. 2 nights of insufficient sleep, the ride to Ashevin, the marsh, the sprint back north. Her body was keeping the accounting even when her mind was too occupied to check in with it. The fine tremor in her hands when they were still, the way sounds were arriving a fraction too loud, the specific fatigue that sat behind the eyes and made the world slightly too bright. She'd been more tired. She'd keep. Marin finished. She handed Evelyn the copies in a sealed inner envelope and looked at her with the direct, worried gaze of a 19-year-old who had committed fully to something and was only now registering what that meant. Are you safe? Marin asked. For the moment. Evelyn took the envelope. You should know that Voss is aware you helped me. He may not have specifics yet, but the moment he realizes you're the source of the files, I know. The girl's voice was steady. I've been thinking about that. Is there somewhere you can go that's outside his reach? My mother's people are in the eastern lowlands, Gareth's territory. Go there. Evelyn said it without room for discussion. Today, don't take anything that looks like you're leaving. Take what you can carry in a shoulder bag and walk out the market gate during the midday rotation. Marin nodded. Then, will it work? What you're doing? Evelyn thought about how to answer that honestly, without being either false or cruel. I don't know, she said. But the alternative is doing nothing, and nothing has a known outcome. She looked at the girl. Go east. Don't stop. She left Marin in the records room and moved back toward the central tower. She needed to be out of the keep before the guard escort Voss had arranged arrived at Darius's study. She'd bought an hour, maybe less, and that hour was contingent on Darius doing what she thought he would, which was investigate quietly before he moved, because that was how he operated, careful and internal, verifying before committing. She'd spent 10 years watching him work, and she was betting her remaining freedom on reading him correctly one more time. She was halfway down the servants' corridor when she heard the footsteps, not the random foot traffic of a working keep. Coordinated. Multiple people, moving with the particular compressed urgency of a group that knew where it was going. She stepped into a storage alcove and pressed herself against the wall. 6 guards came through the cross corridor at the junction ahead, palace colors, which meant these were Darius's household guard, not Voss's private arrangement. They were moving toward the east wing, not toward her, and they were moving fast. She waited until they passed. Then she heard from somewhere above her in the tower raised voices. She couldn't make out words at this distance, but she recognized the acoustic signature of 2 people in direct confrontation, and she recognized one of the voices as Darius's. The particular register of it when he was no longer managing his volume because managing his volume had ceased to be the priority. She moved back toward the tower stairwell. She should have been going the other way. She knew that. The logical move, the survival move, was Southwest Gate, Kale, the horses, and distance. The folio was in her coat. The copies were with Darius. She'd done what she'd come to do. She went up the stairs. The voices were coming from the receiving room on the 2nd level, not Darius's study, the larger space that was used for formal audiences, which meant someone had escalated this from a private conversation to something that required witnesses. She stopped outside the door. It was open 4 inches. Darius's voice, "When were you going to tell me?" Voss, "My lord, the woman has fabricated." "Don't!" The word hit like something physical. "Don't do that again. I've had the seal verified. 2 of my personal guard confirmed it in the last 20 minutes. That is your seal on a commission document for a Gray Territory practitioner 8 months ago. So I will ask you again, and you will answer me. When were you going to tell me?" Silence, long enough that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. Then Voss said, quietly and carefully, "When it no longer mattered." The receiving room went absolutely still. Evelyn understood, in that moment, exactly how much Voss had just miscalculated. He'd answered honestly, not from remorse, but from the particular arrogance of a man who had been operating from a position of unassailable power for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like not to have it. He'd answered the way a man answers when he believes the situation is still recoverable, and honesty is the fastest route through. He was wrong. She heard Darius move, the heavy, deliberate footfall of a large man crossing a stone floor with intent. Then Voss's voice, and for the first time since she'd known him, she heard something in it that might have been fear. "The summit has already been confirmed. The 4 Alpha lines have their invitations. If you move against the council now, you destabilize. Get out of my keep." "My lord, you don't understand what you're—" "I understand exactly what I'm looking at." Darius's voice was very quiet now, which with him was always worse than loud. "I am looking at 8 months of deliberate manipulation of my household, my bond, and my judgment. I am looking at a governance amendment I was never shown. I am looking at 4 riders you sent without authority to intercept a woman under my exile order in a territory outside my jurisdiction to recover documentation you knew would expose you." A pause. Get out of my keep. You have until sundown. If you're on Moonfire land after sundown, I will treat it as a hostile act. She heard the receiving room door on the far side open. She heard Voss leave. She let out a breath she'd been holding without realizing it, and in the moment she released it, everything she'd been holding structurally, the 12 hours of forward motion, the discipline of the kept face and the level voice, and the survival mode focus, everything shifted because the thing she'd been bracing for had just resolved, partially, in the direction she'd needed. She turned to go down the stairs. Evelyn, Darius's voice from inside the room. Close. He'd heard her in the corridor. She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She took one breath, slow, through the nose, fully into the lungs, and in that breath she did the accounting that she'd been deferring for 48 hours. All of it. The ceremony. His hand reaching for Celine's, the word insufficient spoken in front of 500 people in a room she'd worked in for a decade. The exile order with his signature on it. The pack bond severing, which she could still feel the absence of like a missing limb. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway. The receiving room's morning light was behind him, and his face was in partial shadow, which was convenient because she suspected hers was doing things she didn't entirely have control over. You verified the seal, she said. Yes. How long? 20 minutes after you left the study. He held her gaze. I didn't wait. She absorbed that. It meant he'd started believing her before he'd had confirmation, or at minimum, he'd taken the question seriously enough to move immediately, which with Darius was functionally the same thing. The summit, she said. Voss will contact the Alpha Lines before sundown. He'll try to move the timeline or shift the location. I know, I'm sending riders to Gareth and 2 others in the next hour. Brecken of the Iron March hates Voss. He's been waiting for a legitimate reason to break from the council block. I know Brecken. Then you know he needs an official request, not a back-channel one. He won't move on informal communication. It's a liability. Evelyn. He said her name again in the same way he'd said it in the study. Not stripped, not the ceremony version. The old version. I know Brecken. She stopped. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere in the lower levels, the keep's ordinary sounds continued. The morning shift, the kitchen, the maintenance work that a structure of this size generated constantly, regardless of what was happening in its political upper floors. Life continuing inside the machinery while the machinery trembled. The exile order, she said. She made herself say it clean, without effect. While the investigation is active, it's suspended as of this morning. She looked at him. That's not forgiveness, she said. I need you to understand that. What you did at that ceremony, I know what I did. In front of 500 people, with my title, with the pack bond, I know. His voice came out rough in a way she hadn't heard before. I know what I did. She held his gaze for a long moment. There was more to say. There was going to be more to say for a long time, and some of it was going to be genuinely brutal, because the truth of what had happened between them in the last 14 months, not just the conspiracy's manufactured version, but the real erosion, the real distance, the 14 months of Voss and Crane and Aldrich working quietly on a man's insecurities until the manufactured evidence found prepared ground. That truth was going to take longer than a morning to speak. She was not ready to speak it yet. She needed to still be functional. When the summit riders come back with confirmations, she said, I need to be in those conversations, not as Luna, as the person who has been building the intelligence picture since the ceremony. She paused. Can you give me that? Yes. She nodded once, turned to go. She was 3 steps down the stairwell when she heard him behind her, not following, just speaking, from the doorway, into the stairwell's stone acoustics. She doesn't know, he said. Celine, I talked to her this morning. Whatever they told her, she believed it. She thought the bond was real. Evelyn kept walking. I know, she said. She made it to the southwest corridor before her hands started shaking in earnest. She pressed them flat against the cold wall and breathed through it, 5 seconds in, 5 out, until the tremor passed. Not grief. Not yet. Later, she'd have the privacy to open that particular room and look at what was inside it. Right now, she needed to get back to Kael, pull the Northern Rider routes, and figure out which of the 4 Alpha lines could be peeled away from Voss's coalition before the summit. She pushed off the wall. She'd taken 4 steps when the explosion hit. Not fire. Sound, massive and concussive, from somewhere in the upper level of the keep. The stone shook under her feet. Dust fell from the ceiling joints in a fine veil. Somewhere above her, something large had come down hard. She ran back to the stairwell. The second level was filling with smoke from the east end of the receiving corridor. Not fire smoke. The gray-white of something chemical, something that had been designed to move fast through enclosed spaces and disorient. She knew what that was. She'd seen it used in the border raids 3 years ago. She pulled her collar over her mouth and moved toward the smoke because Darius was on the second level, and she had just spent 12 hours recovering critical evidence against a conspiracy that could not afford to let him live long enough to act on it. Voss had not left the keep. He'd sent word ahead. She understood it with the flat, furious clarity of a woman who had spent 48 hours being 2 steps behind and was not willing to be 2 steps behind anymore. Voss had walked out of the receiving room knowing the game had turned, and he had made exactly the calculation that any man in his position would make, that a living Alpha King with the evidence in hand was more dangerous than a dead one, and that the window between his expulsion and sundown was enough time to close that problem permanently. The smoke was thicker at the top of the stairs. She could hear shouting, the particular sharp chaos of guards responding to something they hadn't been briefed for. She went through the smoke at a low crouch. The receiving room door was off its hinges. Inside, 2 of Darius's household guard were down. Not dead, she could see breathing, but incapacitated. A third was fighting someone in the far doorway. And Darius was at the center of the room, on his feet, with blood along his left temple from the concussive impact, facing 2 men she didn't recognize who had the specific body language of professional violence. Her right hand found the knife at her hip, the one she'd been carrying since the Ashvin territory, the one she'd hoped she wasn't going to need. She came through the doorway, low and fast, and drove her elbow into the back of the nearest attacker's knee. The man went down. Not cleanly. He was trained and he was heavy, and he turned the fall into a roll that brought him back up already pivoting, but it broke his attention off Darius for long enough that Darius moved, and a man like Darius in motion, with the specific focused intention of someone who had been underestimated by people who thought smoke and numbers would be enough, was a different proposition than a man standing still. The next 40 seconds were not elegant. They were the grinding, brutal wall and floor violence of a confined space with too many bodies and not enough sight lines. She took a hit across the shoulder that spun her into the wall and knocked the knife loose. She recovered it off the floor and drove it into the second attacker's thigh. Not fatal, not meant to be, meant to take the leg out. It did. The first attacker was dealing with Darius. When it was over, both men were down. Darius was breathing hard through his nose, one hand pressed to the wound at his temple, and his eyes were moving around the room with the automatic threat assessment of a man whose body had just run a program his mind was still catching up to. He looked at her. She was upright. Shoulder aching, hands cut from the floor recovery, coat torn at the seam. The folio was still inside it. She verified that immediately before anything else. "Voss," she said. "Yes." He was already moving toward the far door. "He'll have more than 2. "I know." He stopped at the door and looked back at her, and in his face she saw something she hadn't seen in 14 months. Not warmth exactly, but the very specific regard of a man looking at someone he'd just watched run toward a fight on his behalf and who was in the process of substantially revising a set of assumptions. "Are you?" "I'm fine." She straightened. "Get to your command guard, the ones Voss doesn't have access to." "And you?" She looked at him across the smoke-grayed room with its 2 incapacitated guards, and its broken door, and its evidence of how quickly everything could come apart. "I'm going after Voss," she said. The words came out of her like something her body had decided before her mind finished the sentence, and she felt the truth of them settle into her bones like cold water, because she understood, in the way that people understand things when they've been stripped of every option except the one they'd been avoiding, that she had stopped being the person who managed from the edges. That person had been useful once. That person had kept things running and kept the peace and kept herself one step removed from the machinery's hardest edges because she'd believed for 10 years that the edges weren't her work. The edges were her work now. No title, no bond, no pack, no room left to manage from a distance. He's going to run for the Northern Territories, she said. If he reaches the summit before we do, the 4 Alpha lines will move on the keep the moment they get word he's been expelled. They're already staged. She looked at Darius. I can get to him before he's out of Moonfire Land. But once I do, you need to be ready to move on the summit, officially, with force. Because the moment I intercept Voss, we're in open conflict, and there's no version of this that ends quietly. Darius held her gaze. What do you need? He said. She thought about it for exactly 1 second. 2 fast horses, she said. Kale at the southwest gate. And your word that when I bring you Voss, whatever condition he's in, the investigation proceeds and the summit is your next move. You have it. She went through the door and down the stairs and across the courtyard at a dead run, and the smoke was still rising behind her from the upper level, and somewhere ahead in the northern road dust, a man who had spent 14 months engineering her destruction was trying to outrun the consequences. She had been managed, positioned, removed, and nearly killed. She was done being managed. Kale had the horses ready. He read her face the moment she came through the southwest gate at a run and didn't ask questions, just tightened the second horse's girth, handed her the reins, and swung up onto his own mount with the practiced economy of a man who had spent his life being ready to move before the conversation finished. North Road, she said. Voss? He has maybe a 20-minute lead. He'll push hard to the territory border and then slow down. He'll think the border is safety. She turned the horse. It isn't. They went out the gate at a gallop. The North Road cut through open farmland for the first 3 miles before it hit the forest line, and in the early morning the visibility was good. Cold, flat light, the kind that showed everything without flattering anything. She pushed the horse hard and scanned the road ahead, and let her mind run the problem in the background the way it had learned to run problems. The constant low-level calculation that 10 years of political survival had built into her like a second heartbeat. Voss had resources outside the keep. He'd been building this for 14 months, and men who built things that carefully didn't build without redundancy. He'd have contacts in the Northern Territories who could receive him, stall for time, get word to the Summit Alphas before Darius's riders arrived. The window she had to intercept him before he became someone else's protected asset was narrow, and it was closing. She thought about what she'd said to Darius. Whatever condition he's in, she'd meant it. She was aware of what that meant about what she was becoming, or rather what she'd always been underneath the 10 years of measured political management. The thing she'd kept in a back room because it hadn't been needed yet, because there had always been another mechanism, another lever, another route through that didn't require her to be the sharpest edge in the room. The back room was open now. She was not going to close it again. Bob. They caught sight of Voss 4 miles north of the keep, just before the forest line. He was riding with 2 men, not the palace guard configuration, personal riders, the kind that were kept separately from official household accounts. He was pushing his horse harder than a 63-year-old man should have been pushing it, and he was leaning forward in the saddle with the posture of someone who had made a decision and was committed to the physics of it. Evelyn came off the main road into the parallel tree line and pushed through the edge of the forest at an angle that would intercept the road 50 yards ahead of Voss's position. Kale came with her, reading the geometry without being told. The trees were thin here, the early forest growth before the canopy thickened, and the ground was uneven but passable. Her horse took a low branch hit across the shoulder and didn't break stride. She felt the impact through her own body and kept her weight forward. They came out of the tree line onto the road directly in front of Voss's party. His lead rider pulled up hard. The horse skidded on the packed earth, front legs churning, and the rider had his hand on his weapon before he'd fully stopped. Voss pulled up behind him. His face, when he saw her, did something she hadn't expected. It went still rather than surprised, the stillness of a man who had gambled that she'd be dealing with the keep's aftermath, and had been wrong. He held the stillness for 2 seconds, which was the time it took him to reassess. Then he said very calmly, "Move aside." "No," she said. His lead rider came forward. Kale moved to intercept, and the two of them locked into the controlled, grinding work of two trained men in a space too narrow for either to have a clean advantage. The second of Voss's riders went left, trying to come around her. She turned the horse hard into his approach, and the horses collided shoulder to shoulder, the impact shuddering through her spine, through the hurt shoulder from the receiving room, and she locked her jaw on the pain and kept her position and let her horse's momentum do the work. The rider went sideways. He didn't go down. Good seat, she noted distantly. But he went sideways enough that she cleared him and pushed her horse directly alongside Voss's. He was reaching for something at his belt. She grabbed his wrist. He was stronger than he looked, which she'd expected. The musculature of a once substantial man didn't disappear entirely. And he wrenched against her grip with genuine force. She held. The horses were moving under them, both animals reading the tension and stepping in tight, anxious circles. And the road was narrow and the tree line was close, and everything about this was wrong for anything precise. "It's over," she said. Not loud. She was close enough that she didn't need loud. "You sent assassins into the keep. That's not council politics. That's an attempt on the Alpha King's life. And there is no version of this where you talk your way out of it. You have nothing." His voice was steady, which she gave him credit for. "The folio is fabricated. You're a removed Luna in violation of—" Darius verified the seal. She kept her grip. 20 minutes after I showed it to him. Your own commission record in your own hand. She watched his face. He knows about the suppression. He knows about the summit. He's sending riders to Gareth and Brecken right now. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Recalculation. "The summit proceeds regardless," he said. 4 alpha lines and the quorum of the Elder Council. Even if Darius moves against it, the legal structure isn't legal. She cut him off. Because the bond certification that gives Seleni's position its authority is fraudulent, which means the council quorum that approved your governance amendment was convened under false premises, which means none of it is binding. She held his gaze. You built the whole thing on a foundation that doesn't exist. His wrist stopped fighting against her grip. In that stillness, she saw it. The specific quality of a man looking at the work of 14 months coming apart, not in a rush, but in the slow, comprehensive way of a structure whose keystone has been removed. He'd been building toward a legal permanence. He'd been meticulous about the legal permanence, and she had just told him, accurately, that the legal permanence had never existed. "Come back to the keep," she said, voluntarily. "It matters for what comes after." "What comes after is the same regardless of how I return," he said. But there was something different in his voice. The authority had thinned. "No," she said, "it isn't. A man who returns voluntarily and makes a full account of what was built and who sanctioned it has a different future than a man who is brought back over his horse and faces the Alpha Council's summary process." She paused. "You know that." He looked at her. She looked back. Whatever he saw in her face, whatever 10 years of surviving this kingdom's machinery had put there, made him stop moving entirely. They rode back south with Voss between them. His 2 riders had been unhorsed, not killed, not badly hurt, but effectively removed from the equation. Kale had a cut along his forearm that he'd wrapped with a strip from his riding coat without commentary. Evelyn's shoulder was a sustained low throb that she was managing by not thinking about it. Voss rode without speaking. She watched him from the corner of her eye and thought about what he'd built and why. And she found, to her own cold surprise, that she understood it. Not forgave it, not excused it, but understood it the way you understand the logic of something that has been constructed carefully by an intelligent person operating from a set of values entirely different from your own. He'd looked at the Moonfire throne and seen a structure that had been concentrating power in one bloodline for generations, and he'd decided the correction required more than policy. It required a fundamental restructuring, and he'd concluded that the restructuring required the removal of the one person in the political apparatus whose instincts ran consistently counter to consolidation of elder authority. He'd been right about her being the obstacle. He'd been wrong about what happened to kingdoms that cut out their own structural supports. The keep was in controlled chaos when they returned. Darius had moved fast, faster than she'd expected, which recalibrated something in her assessment of where he'd been these past 14 months. Not absent, not complicit, genuinely managed, A man whose natural decisive capacity had been systematically undermined by people who understood that if you couldn't remove the king, you made him doubt the people who kept him clear-eyed. The command guard was assembled in the main courtyard. 3 of the Elder Council's remaining members were being held in the East Wing pending investigation. The summit riders Darius had dispatched were already an hour north. He was at the center of the courtyard when she rode in with Voss. He looked at Voss. He looked at her. He looked at the state of her. The torn coat, the shoulder she was holding at a slightly wrong angle, the road dust, and the edge that had replaced whatever softer thing had been in her face before she'd gone out that gate. He didn't comment on any of it. That was correct, and she registered that he understood it was correct. "Elder Voss," he said. "My lord." The old man's voice had returned to its formal register. If he was afraid, he wasn't showing it. She could respect that even now. "You'll be held pending the Alpha Council's independent review." Darius looked at him steadily. "You'll have the opportunity to make a full account. I'd advise you to take it." Voss was handed over to the command guard. He went without resistance. She dismounted. The ground under her feet felt strange for a moment. The transition from the body's hard focus back to the world's ordinary physics, the way everything caught up at once when you let it. She stood still until the moment passed. Darius came to stand beside her. Not close. The right distance. "The summit riders?" she asked. Gareth responded within the hour. "He's invoking the independent review process, formal, on record, exactly the way you said he would." He paused. "Brecken's messenger came back 20 minutes ago. He's withdrawing from the summit invitation and requesting a direct audience." She exhaled. "That pulls 2 of the 4 Alpha lines out of Voss's coalition," she said. "The remaining 2 won't move without a quorum." "That's my read as well." "You'll need to address the council amendment formally, nullify the approval process on the basis of the fraudulent bond certification." "Already drafted." She looked at him. "You've been busy," she said. "You left me with documentation and a direction." Something moved through his voice, not quite wry, but adjacent to it. "I know how to work with documentation and a direction." She almost said something. She stopped herself. "Not yet." The thing between them was going to require a different kind of space than a courtyard with the command guard 6 feet away and the keep's chaos still settling. "Celine," she said instead. He was quiet for a moment. "She's in the East Wing. He stopped. "She's not part of this. Not knowingly." "I know." Evelyn looked at the courtyard. "She'll need to be told about the bond suppression, officially by a physician she trusts, with documentation. Not by you and not by me." She paused. "The truth of what she is in this is complicated enough that she needs to hear it from someone she can't accuse of having a stake in the telling." He nodded slowly. "I'll arrange it." "And Darius," she made herself look at him directly. "The governance amendment question, the real one, underneath all the criminal mechanics of how Voss pursued it, the question of whether the Elder Council has legitimate oversight authority over military command, that's going to have to be addressed properly, not suppressed, properly. Because the Alphas who signed on to Voss's coalition did it because there's a real grievance in there somewhere underneath the power grab." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because if you suppress the legitimate grievance to deal with the criminal mechanism, you'll have this conversation again in 5 years with someone smarter and more patient than Voss." "I understand." A pause. "Will you be in the room when we have it?" She thought about that. "I'll be in the room," she said, "but we're going to have to talk first about what that means. What I am in that room. What my standing is." She kept her voice level. "Because I'm not walking back into 10 years ago. Whatever comes next is different." "I know that too." She nodded once. She was going to go inside. She was going to find a room with a door she could close, and she was going to sit down for the first time in 2 days and let herself feel what she'd been carrying in that back room with the door shut. She was 3 steps away when the horn sounded, not the keep's standard signal horn. The northern perimeter alarm, 3 short blasts followed by a long one, which was the code she'd helped develop 7 years ago for a specific scenario. Armed force approaching from the north. Not a small scouting party. Force. She turned. Darius was already moving toward the rampart stairs, and his face had the flat, focused look of a man shifting registers. She moved with him without discussion. From the north rampart, the road was visible for 2 miles. What was on that road? What had been moving toward them while she'd been intercepting Voss, while the command guard had been assembling, while the careful administrative work of undoing a conspiracy had been proceeding in the keep's interior, was not a scouting party. It was an army, not the full force of any one territory. The combined configuration of multiple pack forces moving in coordinated columns. She counted 4 distinct banner configurations before her eyes confirmed what her gut had already told her. 4 alpha lines, all 4, including the 2 whose summit invitations had supposedly just been withdrawn. They were already moving, Cale said from beside her. He'd come up the rampart stairs behind them, his wrapped arm held slightly away from his body. Before your riders reached them, before Voss was intercepted, they were already in motion. She looked at the army on the north road. She looked at its size, which was substantial, which was the size of a force that had been staged and coordinated over weeks, not improvised in response to a morning's events. The summit was never the plan, she said. The words came out of her in the flat, quiet tone of a woman who has been 2 steps behind something and has just, finally, arrived at the step it was actually on. The summit was the distraction, Cale said. The summit was what they needed Darius focused on. A political process with a timeline, a legal argument, a negotiation window, something that would keep the keep's military attention oriented toward deliberation. She looked at the army. While they moved, Darius stood beside her with his hands on the rampart stone and his jaw set, and the particular look on his face of a man who has understood the full shape of something and is in the process of deciding what he is going to be inside that shape. She understood that look. She'd been wearing its equivalent for 2 days. How long to get the command guard fully deployed? She said. An hour. His voice was very quiet. Do we have an hour? A pause. At current pace, they're 2 hours out. Then we have an hour. She looked at the force on the road. 4 lines, coordinated, staged over weeks. This was not a conspiracy anymore. This was a war, and it had been a war since before the ceremony, since before the first rider, and everything that had happened in the last 48 hours had been not the cause of it, but the reveal. She felt the weight of that settle into her chest, and she did not flinch from it. This was what they'd removed her to prevent. Not a policy disagreement, not a dynastic reshuffling. This, a woman who would have seen it coming, because she'd spent 10 years building the intelligence networks and the pack relationships and the cross-territorial communication that made seeing it coming possible, and who would have had the credibility and the standing to warn the king in time for it to matter. They'd removed her 8 months ago. If Cale hadn't come to the guest room, if Marin hadn't pulled those files, if she'd done what exile orders were designed to make people do and gone quietly to the western lowlands and stayed there. She stopped that thought. It wasn't useful, and she didn't have the luxury of useful regrets right now. The Bryn sisters, she said. What? Darius turned to her. The coastal territory alphas. They're not in those columns. I can see 4 banner configurations, and the Bryn territory isn't one of them. She looked at him. They were at the ceremony. They worked with me on the fishing rights mediation. They watched what happened at the ceremony, and they didn't like it. She held his gaze. If I go to them now, not as Luna, not asking for the kingdom, asking for 300 coastal fighters in the next hour, do you think they say no? He looked at her. He looked at the army on the road. He looked back at her. The Bryn sisters don't move for the king, he said. No, she said. They move for me. She held the moment for exactly the time it needed to be held. So that's the question, whether you can spend the next hour deploying your command guard and trusting me to bring the Bryns. The army was 2 hours out. She'd need 40 minutes to reach the Bryn camp in the eastern staging ground she'd identified from the banner gaps in that formation. 40 minutes there, a conversation she had no time to be gentle about, and 40 minutes back with or without 300 fighters and the territorial commitment that would tell the 4-line coalition that the keep had more support than they'd calculated. Darius looked at the north road. He looked at the damage in her shoulder, which she hadn't mentioned and which was visible anyway in the way she was holding herself. He looked at her face. Whatever 10 years of standing beside him had taught him to read there. Whatever was written in the stillness and the precision and the complete absence of anything that resembled desperation made him straighten from the rampart stone and turn to his command guard captain. "Get the deployment moving," he said. "Full configuration, north-facing, rampart, and ground positions." He turned back to Evelyn. "Go," he said. She went. Down the rampart stairs at a run, back across the courtyard to the horse she hadn't unsaddled, because some part of her had known when she dismounted that she wasn't done yet. She swung up with her good arm, and the hurt shoulder screamed the accounting she'd been deferring, and she locked it away and turned the horse east. Cale came alongside her as she cleared the gate. "You're not coming," she said. "I'm coming." "Your arm is not my riding arm." He pulled even with her. "The Bryn sisters have met me twice. I'm a reference point." She let it go. He wasn't wrong. They rode east at the edge of what the horses could sustain, and the morning was full, cold, and bright, and behind them the keep's alarm horn was sounding the deployment sequence, and ahead of them, somewhere in the tree line that bordered the eastern staging ground, 300 fighters who hadn't yet been told which side of this day's accounting they were going to be on. She thought about what she was going to say to them. She thought about the Bryn sisters, Rilla and Dace, mid-30s, inheritors of their father's coastal territory, practical and blunt, and deeply uninterested in the capital's political theater, but acutely interested in anything that threatened the trade routes and pack stability their territory depended on. She thought about what she had to offer them. Not the crown's protection. She had no standing to offer that. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the form it had taken before. Not a trade agreement or a formal alliance document or anything that could be put on paper and ratified through channels that no longer recognized her signature. She had the truth about what was on that North Road and what it would do to their territory if it got through the keep. She had the fishing rights mediation that she'd personally stayed awake 3 nights to resolve in their favor when the capital's easier move would have been to side with the larger pack. She had 10 years of showing up when people needed someone to actually show up. She had whatever that was worth. She was about to find out. The tree line came up fast. Cale pulled up slightly. "East camp, 200 yards in. There's a sentry line." "I see it." She could see the sentry position in the tree line's shadow. 2 figures, close together, the posture of people who'd been told to watch the road. "Don't reach for anything." They slowed to a walk and came into the sentry line with their hands visible. "Evelyn Hart," she said, "former Luna of the Moonfire Throne. I need 5 minutes with Alpha Rilla." The sentries looked at her, looked at each other. One of them turned and moved quickly into the trees. She waited. The other sentry watched her with the careful attention of trained personnel. 40 seconds, a minute. Then Rilla Bryn came out of the trees. She was 37, broad through the shoulders, with the outdoors weathered look of a woman who spent most of her time in the field rather than a hall. She stopped 10 feet from Evelyn's horse and looked up at her with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who had been watching the North Road herself this morning and had already formed opinions. "I heard what he did to you," Rilla said, "at the ceremony." "I know." Evelyn held her gaze. "I don't have time for that conversation right now. What I have time for is telling you what's on the North Road and why it matters to your territory as much as ours." Rilla looked at her. "How much time do we have?" she said. "Less than 2 hours before they hit the keep's position." Rilla turned her head slightly toward the camp behind her without taking her eyes off Evelyn. "Dace!" she called. Footsteps in the leaves. Her sister emerged from the tree line and stopped beside her, younger by 3 years, leaner, with the same direct quality in her eyes. Rilla looked at Dace. Dace looked at Evelyn. "Talk," Dace said. Evelyn talked. She laid it out in the blunt, compressed way she'd have wanted to hear it herself. The conspiracy, the summit, the 4-line coalition, the Army's current position and pace, and the gap in the Moonfire Keep's southern approach that 300 coastal fighters on the eastern flank could close before the first wave hit the wall. She didn't soften it. She didn't promise them anything she couldn't deliver. She told them what the fight looked like and what it would cost, and what the territory's strategic position would be in a post-conflict kingdom that owed its survival partly to the Bryn lines showing up. She talked for 4 minutes. When she stopped, Rilla and Dace looked at each other in the particular way of people who had been making decisions together their whole lives. Rilla looked back at Evelyn. "You're not Luna anymore," she said. "No." "So who are you asking as?" Evelyn held the look. The question landed in the center of everything. The 48 hours, the ceremony, the folio, the receiving room fight, the marsh and the riders and the rampart and the army on the North Road. All of it came down to this. Not the title, not the bond, not the 10 years of accumulated political standing. Who was she asking as? "Someone who will remember who showed up," she said. The sisters looked at each other again. Dace said, "Get your horse out of our staging ground. We move faster without you in the formation." She moved her horse. Behind her, she heard Rilla's voice lifting through the trees, sharp, carrying, the voice of a woman who had been waiting to be given a clear direction. And the camp came alive with the sound of 300 people receiving an order they'd been trained for. She turned the horse back west. The keep was on the horizon. The army was on the North Road. And somewhere in the keep's rampart position, Darius Vale was deploying a command guard that was not quite enough, and watching the east tree line for the question she'd gone to answer. She rode hard. The hurt shoulder was a sustained roar she'd stopped trying to manage and was simply living inside of. Her eyes were burning from the cold and the pace and 48 hours of sustained crisis. The horse was breathing in the deep, labored way of an animal that had been pushed far and was pushing further on what it had left. She matched it. They were a mile out from the keep when she heard it. Not the keep's alarm horn, but something larger, something from the north that carried across the flat farmland in the cold air like a physical impact. The four-line coalition's war signal. They weren't 2 hours out anymore. They'd accelerated. She looked at the North Road from across the distance and saw the dust cloud that meant movement at pace, and she felt in her chest the hard, clarifying arithmetic of too little time and too much ground. And she rode. The keep's main gate was ahead. The rampart was lined with the command guard, and in the north, coming fast now, the coordinated force of 4 alpha lines and 14 months of preparation was bearing down on the last thing standing between a conspiracy and the kingdom it intended to hollow out. She was going to make it through the gate. She was going to get to the rampart. She was going to stand beside Darius Vale and face what was coming, and for the first time in her life, stripped of every title, every formal protection, every institutional buffer she'd spent 10 years constructing between herself and the hardest edges of what this kingdom required, she was going to do it as exactly what she was. Nothing less. Nothing hidden. Nothing held in reserve. The gate opened ahead of her. She didn't slow down. She made it through the gate with 40 seconds to spare. The keep's main yard was controlled chaos. The command guard deploying in the disciplined, compressed motion of trained people moving fast without running, the rampart positions filling, the supply lines running ammunition to the wall stations in the low, efficient trot of people who had rehearsed this. Darius was on the north rampart. She could see him from the yard, the dark silhouette of him against the cold sky, already in the posture of command, weight forward, hands on the stone, head up, reading the field. She hit the rampart stairs at speed and came up beside him breathing hard. He looked at her, at the state of her, at the east tree line. "They're coming," she said. "I can hear them." He kept his eyes north. "The Brins?" "Moving. Eastern flank. Dace is leading the advance formation." She caught her breath in 2 controlled pulls and looked at the North Road. The dust cloud was closer now, close enough to see the banner configurations without needing the rampart's height advantage. They pushed their timeline. Someone told them Voss was intercepted. He said it flatly. Not accusation. Accounting. Yes. Which meant the coalition had a secondary signal protocol, a contingency that didn't require Voss's direct command to trigger. She filed that. It meant the 4 alpha lines had been operating with enough autonomy from Voss's direct coordination that intercepting him hadn't decapitated the operation. It also meant the battle ahead was not going to end when the field was won. The political unraveling would take longer. But first the field. "Their left flank is light," she said, reading the formation. "The Iron March banner, Brecken's people, the ones who supposedly withdrew. They're still in the column, but they're 3 rows back and their spacing is wrong." She looked at Darius. "They're not committed." He followed her read. She could see him taking it in, the quick integration of field intelligence that was, she registered it without sentiment, genuinely his best capability. Whatever Voss had done to him over 14 months, he hadn't been able to touch this. Darius Vale reading a field was Darius Vale in the fullness of what he was. If Brecken's people break before contact, he said, the left flank collapses and the coalition loses its pincer. They'd have to regroup, which cost them the momentum advantage. She held his gaze. We need someone to talk to Brecken's field commander before they hit the line. That's not a rampart conversation. No, it's a between-the-lines conversation. She looked at him steadily. I know his field commander, Aldous. He was at the fishing rights mediation. Brecken sent him as an observer. We've met twice. Darius was quiet for 2 seconds. You're asking me to let you ride out before the lines close. I'm asking you to let me do the thing that has the best probability of ending this without the full engagement. She kept her voice level. If Brecken's people hold formation and we fight this through to full contact, we win. The Brins on the eastern flank guarantee that. But we lose 200 people doing it, maybe more. A pause. I'd rather not. He looked at her. She looked back. She was aware, in the background of the field assessment and the tactical calculation, of what this moment was, of the specific quality of a man and a woman standing on a wall, looking at a war they were about to fight together, after everything that had passed between them, after everything that had been done and said and signed and survived. There was something almost clarifying about it. All the complexity of the last 10 years reduced to this particular question. Did he trust her judgment enough to let her ride out? Take Kale, he said. She went, quiet. The space between two armies before the lines close has a particular quality that has nothing to do with silence. It is, in fact, full of sound, the machinery of thousands of people and animals preparing for violence. But there is something in the human ear that registers the space between as quieter than it is, because the brain is doing something else with its attention, running the oldest calculation there is. She rode out through the keep's south postern with Kale and a white signal cloth. Not surrender, the old pre-battle parley convention that most of the kingdom's forces still honored, mostly because the people who stopped honoring it tended to end up fighting enemies who had nothing left to lose. The coalition's advance line slowed, not stopped. Slowed, which was enough. She pushed her horse to a controlled canter toward the left flank and looked for Aldous. She found him 40 yards from the advance line, a compact man in his 40s on a gray horse, watching her come with the careful attention of someone who recognized her and was deciding what that recognition meant. She pulled up 6 feet from him. Aldous, she said. Luna Hart. He caught himself. Evelyn. You're 3 rows back, she said. Your spacing is wrong for a committed advance. You're not in this. He looked at her without answering, which was an answer. Brecken sent withdrawal notice this morning, she said. Darius received it. It was good faith, and we treated it as such. What happened between that message and this formation? Aldous' jaw moved slightly. The other lines moved before the withdrawal could be formally communicated up the coalition command. We were already in the march. Are you willing to be not in the march now? A long pause. The army around them was continuing its slow forward motion. She had maybe 3 minutes before the advance line made the question academic. What Voss built, she said, is over. He's in custody. The bond suppression documentation is in the Alpha King's hands, and the Elder Council review process is already invoked. The legal foundation for the governance amendment doesn't exist. She looked at him steadily. Brecken has a real grievance about how this throne has managed the border territories. That grievance is legitimate, and it is going to be heard in a formal council process. But not today. Today, the only question is whether Iron March fighters die for a coalition that Brecken already tried to leave. Aldous looked at her. He looked at the keep. He looked at the eastern tree line where, she could see from this angle, the first of the Bryn formation was beginning to emerge. 300 coastal fighters deploying in the unhurried confidence of people who had chosen their moment carefully. She watched him see the Bryns. She watched the calculation run through his face. Pull back, he said. Not to her. To the rider beside him. The rider went. The Iron March left flank began to slow, then stop. Then, in the distinctive rearward motion of a force disengaging from a formation, began to separate from the coalition column. The coalition's advance line hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Wars don't always end in a final blow. Sometimes they end in the specific moment when enough of the people involved look at what they're actually doing and decide the accounting doesn't work. The left flank collapse took 7 minutes. The coalition's remaining 3 lines held formation for 4 minutes after that, which was long enough for the Bryn forces to complete their eastern positioning and for the keep's rampart to visibly fill with reinforced personnel. And then the northernmost banner configuration began its own retreat. Not rout, deliberate withdrawal, the kind that preserved enough dignity to allow a future conversation. By the time the second banner followed, the outcome was settled. It was not bloodless. There was a contact engagement on the northeastern approach, a section of the coalition's advance that hadn't received the withdrawal signal in time or hadn't believed it, that lasted 40 brutal minutes and cost lives on both sides. She heard it from the rampart where she'd returned after the parley. She stood and listened to it and felt the weight of each minute of it, the specific heaviness of knowing that what was happening was both necessary and the result of a chain of decisions that had started 14 months ago in a series of private meetings between 3 elders and a young woman who'd been told she was part of something historic. When it ended, the field was quiet in the way that fields are quiet after violence. Not peaceful, not restored, but emptied of the sound that violence makes, and not yet filled by anything else. She stood at the rampart until the last of the coalition withdrawal was confirmed. Then she went down. Celine was in the East Wing sitting room when Evelyn found her. It had been Evelyn's decision to go. Not Darius's request, not anyone's instruction. Her own decision, made in the quiet of the keep's aftermath, while the command guard was processing the day's accounting and Darius was in the war room with his commanders. She'd stood in the corridor outside the East Wing for a full minute before she went in. The girl was 23. Evelyn had confirmed that from the documents. 23 and sitting in a chair by the window in a keep that had spent the last 12 hours either trying to arrest her host or defend itself against an army, and she was holding a cup of something cold and looking at the courtyard below with the expression of someone who has been told a great many things in a short period of time and is working through them in order. She looked up when Evelyn came in. There was no performance in her face, no positioning, just a young woman who was exhausted and frightened and had been carrying, Evelyn understood, the weight of a bond she'd believed was real for months. A bond that a physician had now formally documented as artificially constructed, planted in the space where a suppressed true bond had been cleared away, her own emotional reality used as a tool in someone else's architecture. "They told me this morning," Celine said, "about the suppression." "I know." Evelyn sat down across from her. Not close, the right distance. "I wanted to say it to you directly, from me. What happened to you wasn't your fault." Celine looked at her. Her eyes were red but dry. "They used me." "Yes. I thought—" She stopped. Her hands moved on the cup. "I thought he loved me. I thought the bond was real. I could feel it." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, then steadied. "They put something in me that wasn't real, and I couldn't tell the difference." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about what it would mean to hate this girl. Had tried it, briefly, in the first hours, because hate was simpler than the truth. The truth was that Celine was the other casualty in this, the one who didn't make it into the political accounting because she hadn't been powerful enough to be worth accounting. A young woman whose genuine emotional experience had been manufactured and exploited and was now going to be unwound in public, because there was no private way to undo what had been done publicly. "You couldn't tell the difference," Evelyn said, "because there was nothing wrong with your ability to feel. There was something wrong with what they gave you to feel." She held the girl's gaze. "That's not the same thing." Celine was quiet for a long moment. "What happens to me now?" she said. "You go home to the Whitecrest territory, if you want to, or you stay in the capital and give testimony for the Elder Council review. Either way, you're not a prisoner and you're not accused of anything." Evelyn paused. "The choice is yours. That's not nothing." The girl looked at her. "You could hate me," she said. "It would make sense if you did." "It would be easier," Evelyn agreed. It wouldn't be accurate. She stood. You're 23. You have a long time to figure out what to do with what happened to you. Don't spend it carrying someone else's crime. She left the room. In the corridor, she stood with her back against the stone wall for a moment and breathed through the complicated weight of what she'd just done. Not the difficulty of it, but the strange, specific quality of a thing that had cost something and had been right anyway. Those two things didn't cancel each other out. She was learning to let them exist at the same time. Pachets. The Elder Council's formal review convened 3 weeks later. Voss testified for 2 days. The testimony was complete, and once he'd been made to understand the full extent of what the documentation had preserved, accurate. Crane and Aldrich corroborated the essential facts and disputed the peripheral details in the way of men who had decided that cooperative accounting was their best remaining option. The Ashvin practitioner appeared under protective arrangement and confirmed the suppression method and commission date. The governance amendment was formally nullified. The bond certification was expunged from the record. 3 council seats were vacated, and the appointment process for their replacement was open to an Alpha Council vote for the first time in the kingdom's history. A reform that Evelyn had drafted the structural framework for over 4 nights of work in the small hours while the keep's aftermath was still being processed. Brecken of the Iron March came to the capital in the 2nd week and sat across a table from Darius for 6 hours. Evelyn was in the room. She'd been in the room for every conversation that mattered since the battle, not as Luna. That title was suspended pending a formal council process she'd insisted on, but as the person who held the intelligence picture and the territorial relationships and the working knowledge of every grievance that had made 4 Alpha lines willing to march on the keep. Brecken was difficult. He was supposed to be difficult. His difficulty was legitimate, and it needed to be in the room rather than out in the territories where it would calcify into the next conspiracy's foundation. By the end of the 6 hours, they had a framework, not a solution. A framework. The distinction mattered, and she said so in the room to both of them, in the flat, direct tone she'd stopped moderating. Brecken looked at her when she said it, and then looked at Darius and said, "You should listen to her more." Darius said, "I know." The conversation she and Darius had been deferring happened on a night 3 weeks after the battle, when the keep had gone quiet in the particular way of a structure that has absorbed a great deal in a short time and is settling back into its own weight. He came to the room she'd been given, not the East Wing, not the guest wing, a third space that was neither the past nor a temporary arrangement, which she'd registered as deliberate on his part without commenting on it. He knocked. She opened the door. They sat on opposite sides of a table with a fire between them, and they talked for 4 hours. She said the things that needed to be said about the 14 months, not the conspiracy's version, but the real version, the erosion she'd felt and had not found a way to name, the distance she'd watched open and had tried to address through the channels she knew and had failed, the particular loneliness of being the person who held everything together, and felt herself becoming invisible to the one person whose scene had mattered most. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself before she'd finished, which cost him something. She could see that it cost him something, and she gave him credit for paying it. When she finished, he said, "I was afraid you'd stopped needing me." She looked at him across the table. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, and she'd spent a great deal of the last 3 weeks imagining this conversation from multiple angles, she had not expected that. "You were afraid I'd stop needing you," she said. "You ran that keep. You ran the intelligence networks, the welfare councils, the border mediations. You built the relationships that saved the kingdom 3 weeks ago." His voice was level, but there was something raw running underneath it. "I watched you become more capable every year, and I didn't know what to do with the part of me that found that threatening instead of proud." She was quiet for a long moment. "And Voss found that part," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "He didn't manufacture it. He found it, and he worked with it, fed it, reframed it until the story I was telling myself about why we'd grown apart was one where your strength was the problem instead of my inability to match it." A pause. "I'm not asking you to excuse that. I'm telling you the truth of it because you asked for the truth, and you've earned it." She looked at the fire. She thought about what forgiveness was and what it wasn't, and the difference between forgiving something and accepting it as finished. She'd been turning the question over for 3 weeks with the part of her mind that ran in the background, and she still hadn't arrived at a clean answer, which she was beginning to understand was because clean answers were what people settled for when they were afraid of the complicated ones. "I'm not going back to what we were," she said. "I know. I mean that specifically, the structure of it. The way I held everything together quietly while you held the visible line. The way I made myself smaller when the room needed you to be larger." She met his eyes. "That's done." "I know," he said again. And then, "I don't want that back. I want—" He stopped. He was not a man who reached for language easily, and she'd always known that, and she waited. "I want the kingdom you're capable of helping build, and I want to deserve being in the room while you build it." She looked at him for a long time. Deserving was a different kind of statement than wanting. Wanting was easy. Deserving was a description of ongoing work, of the daily accounting of whether a person was being what they'd said they would be. She'd spent 10 years wanting to be seen and not requiring that she be deserved. The distinction had cost her. She wasn't going to let it cost her again. "Then we start there," she said. "Deserving it." He nodded. Not relief. He hadn't expected absolution tonight, and he'd been right not to. Something more durable than relief. The look of a man who has been told the terms are real and is prepared to meet them. Pohunts. The formal council review reinstated her title 6 weeks after the battle. She'd told them they didn't have to. She'd meant it. The title was a structure, and structures could be rebuilt differently, and she'd spent the weeks of the review period doing the work of rebuilding regardless of what the council decided, because the work was the thing that mattered, and she was done conditioning the work on what she was called while she did it. They reinstated it anyway. Unanimously, which hadn't happened in the council's recorded history. Gareth moved it. Brecken seconded, which she suspected was as close as Brecken came to a public apology, and she accepted it as such. She didn't cry at the reinstatement. She hadn't cried through any of it. Not the ceremony, not the exile order, not the receiving room or the marsh or the rampart. She thought she might have been too busy to cry, and then she thought that wasn't quite right either. And then she understood quietly and without drama that the tears had been waiting for a moment that felt like an ending rather than a continuation. That moment came on a morning 2 months after the battle, when she was standing at the window of her rooms, the east wing, her rooms, the ones that smelled like dried lavender she'd hung herself. And the keep was going about its ordinary business below, and the pack bond had been restored for 6 weeks, and she could feel it again. The warm hum of thousands of connected lives running in the background of her awareness, like a river she'd forgotten the sound of until it came back. She stood at the window and let herself feel the completeness of it. And the tears came finally, and she let them, because she'd earned them, and because there was no one watching, and because knowing when to let something move through you was its own kind of strength, the kind that didn't show, the kind that made all the visible kinds possible. She stood there for a while. Then she dried her face, straightened her spine, and went down to the morning council session, because there was work to do and she was the one to do it. And that had always been true, and was now, finally, recognized as true. And the difference between those two things was the whole story. The kingdom they rebuilt was not the kingdom that had existed before. It was harder in some places and more honest in all of them. The Elder Council's appointment process changed. The Alpha Line's border grievances went through a formal arbitration structure that Evelyn designed and Brecken grudgingly admitted was more functional than the previous arrangement. The Pack Welfare Councils got formal funding allocations written into the foundational law, rather than operating on discretionary budget that could be quietly cut when the political winds shifted. Marin came back from the eastern lowlands. Evelyn offered her a position in the formal intelligence secretariat, the first time such a structure had existed under an official charter rather than as the private informal network Evelyn had built on her own time. Marin accepted and turned out to be precisely as thorough in an official capacity as she'd been in an unofficial one. Cale declined a formal position and accepted a consulting arrangement instead, which was exactly what she'd expected and exactly what she'd offered. Thresh the practitioner cooperated fully with the Elder Council review and was ultimately not prosecuted on Evelyn's recommendation in exchange for complete testimony and a formal prohibition from future suppressions. She'd been pragmatic about it and received some criticism for the pragmatism, and stood by it anyway, because the testimony had been worth more than the prosecution, and she was done making decisions that prioritized appearance over outcome. Voss and the two cooperating elders were removed from the council and confined to house arrest in their respective territories under Alpha Council monitoring, a sentence that dissatisfied everyone in different ways, which Evelyn had learned was the signature of an outcome that was actually calibrated rather than satisfying. She said as much to Darius one evening, months after, sitting at the table in the East Wing with the account she was reviewing and his presence in the other chair that had become, gradually and without ceremony, a habit of evenings. "The Brecken arbitration is going to take another year," she said. "The Eastern Territories are going to push back on the council appointment changes in the spring. The Iron March border question is going to resurface the moment the new trade routes open." She looked up at him. "It doesn't end." "No," he said. "I used to think there was going to be a point where it was settled, where the work was done and the kingdom was what it was supposed to be and we could stop." She looked back at the accounts. "It doesn't work like that." "No," he said again, and then, after a moment, "Is that all right?" She thought about it honestly. She thought about what she'd been before. The woman who managed from the edges, who made herself smaller when the room needed someone else to be larger, who had believed that if she did enough of the quiet work, eventually the quiet work would be seen. She thought about who she was now. Not different, not transformed in the dramatic way of stories, but clarified. The same person with fewer illusions and more knowledge of her own capacity. She thought about the pack bond, warm and constant, the river running. She thought about the morning at the window and the tears she'd finally let come. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." Darius looked at her across the table. She looked back. There was no ceremony in it, no declaration, just two people who had been through the kind of thing that either destroys what is between them or makes it into something that couldn't have existed without the destruction, and who were together doing the long, unspectacular work of being the second thing. Outside the window, the kingdom went about the business of being a kingdom. The packs ran their territories and disputed their borders and brought their grievances to the structures that now existed to hear them. The Elder Council met in its new configuration. The border families in the resettlement programs that Evelyn had fought for years ago sent their regular reports, which Marin filed and Evelyn read. Spring came. The Eastern Territories pushed back on the council appointment changes, as predicted. She handled it. She was still handling it when the first accounts of the new trade route surveys arrived, 6 months after that. And she was handling it when the Iron March border question resurfaced exactly when she'd said it would, and she was handling it in the years after, through the good seasons and the hard ones, through the arguments she and Darius had that were the arguments of two people who were genuinely equal and genuinely different, and had stopped pretending otherwise. She handled it because she was built for it. Because 10 years of making herself smaller hadn't changed what she was underneath, had only deferred it. Because the kingdom needed what she could do, and she had stopped treating that fact as something to be apologetic about. And because on a night 3 months after the battle, when the keep was quiet and the bond was running warm, and Darius was reading in the chair that had become his chair while she worked at the desk that had always been her desk, she had looked across the room at him and understood something that had taken her the whole long, brutal year to arrive at. Strength was not the absence of having been broken. It was not the performance of never having needed anyone, or the armor of never letting anyone close enough to hurt you. Those were just the things people mistook for strength because they were visible, and strength, real strength, was mostly invisible. So it was the choice to stay in the room after you'd been given every reason to leave, the choice to rebuild after you'd watched something burn, the choice to be exactly what you were without apology, in full view, and let the world do what it would with that. She had been broken. She had stayed in the room. She had rebuilt. She was still in the room. That was the whole story, and it was enough.